Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Hey there, this is Joe Fish. I'm the lead producer of The Big Story, and I'm sitting here speaking with the host of The Big Story, Jordan Heath Rawlings. Hello, Jordan. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. We're off enjoying the long weekend right now, but we thought it had been a long time since we provided a little bit of listener feedback for you all. So we're going to do that today, and hopefully you're enjoying it while you're relaxing and not working somewhere.
Yeah, for sure. Always nice to have an opportunity to reach into the bag and pull out some of the thoughtful feedback that we receive from listeners. And if you are a listener who's written into us and we're not going to get to your piece of feedback today,
that means it wasn't thoughtful.
No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that we didn't have time to cover it, but it doesn't mean that we didn't read it.
That's true.
And please keep writing in. All right, so let's start at an episode we did recently. This was, we had a reporter on named Sebastian Braun, who's a reporter with the Hamilton Spectator. And he was on to talk to us about this story out of Hamilton about a woman who has purchased a home in Hamilton with tenants in it. And the tenants are refusing to leave. So she's being forced to, at least on a temporary basis, live out of her car while the case makes its way through the landlord-tenant board. And one listener, well, we had feedback from a few listeners, but one listener in particular sent us a very long, well-thought-out response. I couldn't read it all because it was long, but I cut it down a bit. So this comes to us from Flynn. For the last 4 years, I've worked tirelessly to help tenants fight against evictions. Their lives upended due to the decisions of their landlords among my own fight against such an eviction in 2021. It is reporting like yours for your podcast that does such a disservice to those fighting every day to stay in their homes. These tenants do not wish to become homeless, and they are in the unfortunate situation of not being able to afford a home as their money goes to their landlord. The real issue is how the landlord and her tenants are portrayed. The story juxtaposes the landlord, hardworking, trying her best, dealing with misfortune, to the tenants, liars, dirty, destroyed property, stubborn, implied criminal, in such a way that I have clipped sound bites to show for my next presentation on anti-poor propaganda in the media. It's part of a larger story told that every homeowner is a contributor to the community and Canada writ large, and every tenant is a parasite eating away at the foundation of society. You talk about how it's within the landlord's rights to evict these people and to do it quickly, but then talk about the tenant's rights to fight against losing their home as somehow an unfair and broken practice. Well, you mentioned the tenants would have a difficult time moving because, quote, it's hard for them to find something in the market. There's no question as to the invalidity and amorality of their resistance to the eviction.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty, I don't know that all of that is fair. I think the overall feeling that Flynn had was one that was shared with people. I don't know if the specific claims about what we were doing in the episode were yeah.
Listen, and with all due respect to Flynn, who, as you point out, wrote a very long and detailed and thoughtful response. So I don't mean to disparage it. However, I would urge people, and I'm going to explain in a minute about why we've been resharing some episodes over weekends over the past few months. And on that note, we just reshared yesterday an episode we did last year on an ongoing rent strike by tenants in Western Toronto. And that's not solely to provide a counterpoint to Flynn's perspective, but I did want to reshare it because I would urge anyone, when you listen to 1 or 2 episodes of any podcast that's been going on for a long time, especially a news or cultural issues podcast, to, if they seem to be coming at it from a position you don't agree with, go back in their archives and search for those terms and see if they've covered it from other perspectives. Because, listen, we've done 1,700, 1,800 episodes by now. We've done a lot about the broken landlord-tenant system. Nearly all of it has been from the tenant's perspective. So without getting into the specifics of the story in Hamilton, which I did think was a fascinating illustration of the macro problem of the landlord-tenant board, I would just love it if people would look for all the perspectives that we'd tried to provide, because we're never going to make you all happy in every episode. It's just not going to happen. If we did, we'd be a really boring podcast. So yeah, Flynn, thank you for writing in. I did write back to Flynn and sent them a few of the other episodes we've done and invited them to have a listen. I don't know if they will or not, and it's all good. Like, we welcome all the feedback that anyone wants to send us. But yeah, I would say that The Big Story tries to present varied perspectives on issues that affect everyone. And we're very proud of doing that. That was a long-winded way to say that I don't agree with this feedback, Joe.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm with you. I think saying that they're going to use us as an example of anti-poor propaganda in the media is a little, I don't know. I don't think it's fair. And I've had my own struggles with being a tenant in Toronto. But I think all we were really trying to do with this episode was tell an interesting story and illustrate the fact that this system is working for nobody on either side of that equation.
Exactly.
So, yeah, Flynn, thank you for the feedback. We don't necessarily agree with it, but we do appreciate you writing in to tell us your thoughts. So thanks again. Jordan, just to take a departure from listener feedback for a second, you just mentioned that we're going to be resharing some episodes from the archive on Sundays. Do you want to just maybe elaborate for listeners on why we've decided to do that as of late?
Sure. There's a few reasons, and I like explaining the ins and outs of podcasting on these feedback episodes because I find some of our listeners enjoy it, and I'm a nerd about this stuff. So 3 reasons very quickly. The first is by now, we've been going for well over 6 years. We have, like I said, 1,700, 1,800 episodes, and some of them done a couple of years ago are almost as relevant or even sometimes more relevant today than they were back then, which plays into the second reason, which is that, frankly, we've been growing slowly but steadily for 6 years, and there's an awful lot of people who follow our feeds now that didn't when these episodes aired. So we wanted to give them a chance to experience some of the ones we like the most and that we think matter now. But the third reason is the really interesting thing about podcasting and how it's changed. So a little over a year ago, if you subscribed to the Big Story feed on the major podcast feeds, particularly Apple, which is where the majority of our listeners find us, unless you opted out of it, Apple Podcasts would download every episode of the Big Story into your phone, which would mean that if you'd been a listener since the very beginning, or if you didn't listen to us, say, for 3 weeks because you were really tired of the news, and then you listened to a new episode, Apple Podcasts would download every single episode that you'd missed since last you listened onto your phone. Without you having to listen to those episodes, without you having wanted to even click on them, we would get credit for all those downloads. Your phone would use its memory to hold all those episodes on it until you deleted them. And you might never listen to a single minute. That's not how it works anymore, which is a great thing for podcasting first, because it gives us a more accurate picture of how many people are listening to our episodes and which episodes perform better than others, which is really valuable information for us as we try to be as relevant as possible to what the listeners want. But more so, for you, it means you don't end up with your phone filled with unlistened to podcast episodes. And what it means for resharing old episodes is we are no longer pushing those episodes onto your phone. Like, I don't know if you remember when the U2 album got automatically downloaded to people's iPhones like that.
Yeah.
It's not like that anymore. So when we reshare an episode, as we're calling it on Sundays, really all we're doing is bumping that title and description to the top of your feed. We're not putting it on your phone unless you ask for it. So if it's an episode you've seen before, or it's an episode you don't care about, just don't click on it. You won't be downloading it. We won't think you've listened to it, and we'll have an accurate picture of who's actually listening to what. The long and short of it is this is a change that was really huge for podcasting because it gives so many shows like ours, which have a large audience and an even larger archive, an accurate picture of what listeners really want. And it gives listeners a much more efficient way to get what they actually really want. So it's in that spirit that we share some of these episodes. Like I said, I hope you love them. If you don't, if they're not interesting to you, Don't worry about it. We just bumped it. It's like scrolling past our tweet. Think of it that way.
Yeah, for sure. There you go. A little bit of how the sausage gets made of podcasting. For all you podcast wonks out there, you're welcome.
The podcasting industry is evolving so quickly. It's fascinating. So I love talking about this stuff.
Fascinating for us.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Let's get back to some feedback here. So I want to move on now to, I think I would call this like the issue of the day, which is, well, maybe that's contentious to say, but I want to talk about U.S. politics.
I don't think it's contentious to say that it's the issue of the day in the last few weeks.
Well, we're spoiled for choice, Jordan, it feels like in our current reality, honestly. Yeah, I mean, we kind of put out a call to listeners for feedback about specifically our coverage of U.S. politics. And what we wanted to know from them is, we're a Canadian daily news show. I think it's fair to say that our coverage skews pretty heavily Canadian. Obviously, the United States, what happens there impacts Canada greatly. And we wanted to know if listeners wanted U.S. coverage from us, and the extent to which they did, if they do. So I want to just start off this conversation by reading this feedback we got from Lawson. And he says, I personally come to the big story precisely because it is Canadian and because I want to know more about Canada and keep up with what is happening here. As someone in Generation Z, I do not have cable news. And so listening to podcasts like The Big Story is pretty much the only way that I get Canadian news. While I would not mind hearing about the USA election on occasion, I feel that there are 1001 podcasts covering this topic, whereas what you do at The Big Story is something unique and sorely needed.
Well, first of all, thank you.
We got a Gen Z telling us he listens to the show. That's pretty big, Jordan.
Aren't you Gen Z?
No, I'm a millennial. I think I'm a zillennial, technically.
Okay. That's funny because I'm an exennial. So we're the oldest and youngest millennials in the world.
Yeah.
But anyway, I agree with Lawson's perspective. I think you would also agree that whenever we're forced to choose between a Canadian issue and an issue from America or anywhere else, we will always focus on what matters to Canadians the most. But I also think, and this is the reality of the business, that like USA is the country that moves the needle of the world the most. This is probably one of the more critical periods in that country's political history. And then there is just like the fantastical nature of everything that has been happening in American politics over the past month. It has been an absolute roller coaster ride that has, I think, if I'm speaking for most people who don't necessarily stay fixated to the news all day, it has been one of those periods that draws in even the people that don't usually care about this stuff just because of how surreal it's been. And that's proving true for me in conversations that I'm having with people in my life who I normally don't talk about politics with. And the other side of the news coin is that it is competing with not very much right now in Canada this summer. There are no looming upcoming elections. A parliament is not sitting. So this is what people are talking about when they talk about the news these days. So we're going to focus in on it a little more. I totally understand if, you tend to get your U.S. politics from the New York Times and the Washington Post. I mean, often so do I. But we do have some great correspondents that we talked to, like Aaron Rupar, who we had on last week, who can provide the kind of perspective that maybe you don't hear from mainstream U.S. news and take you a little deeper into how ordinary Americans who pay attention to this stuff are feeling. And like, listen, I'm a news guy. I'm a politics junkie. I find this stuff fascinating. I want to talk about it. So we're doing it a little more than usual until the election. And obviously should go without saying that if a major Canadian news story happens, like, say, another head of state wants to step down and recuse himself from running in the next election, we will always cover that first.
Right. No, for sure. I think the American election is definitely going to restore calm south of the border, and then there will be no stories coming out of the United States that are even worth covering, is my prediction for the year 2025.
Anyway,
let's
talk about rural Canada.
Okay, so this last piece of feedback we're going to cover comes to us from Jesse.
Jesse is an incredibly devoted listener, by the way, and they write in all the time and always great feedback. So I really appreciate this one.
No, for sure. Thank you, Jesse, and please keep writing in. So this one, this is in response to an episode that we did recently with Dr. Laura Ferguson, who is a biologist from Acadia University. Laura joined us to discuss ticks and their increasing prevalence across Canada and all their associated nasty illnesses that they can spread. Hey, Jordan and team. I just listened to your tick episode, and I gotta disagree with Jordan at the end of the episode when he said it was full of practical tips. It may be practical for people who live in urban environments who make an effort to be out in nature, but for those of us in rural Canada, throwing your clothes in a dryer for 20 minutes after being outside is just unrealistic, as we would be doing it every single time we leave the house. Heck, I would be up to double-digit times a day. I really think you were ignoring your rural audience with that episode, as I was eager to learn about ticks, but I got almost nothing that will actually help me other than being scared every time I leave the house.
That's totally good feedback.
For sure. I also want to thank Jesse for making me say the word rural like 5 times, which is like the hardest word to say over and over.
You ever seen The Rural Juror?
Yeah, of course. The Rural Juror.
Okay.
Classic.
Just making sure. Well, we just talked about how you were a Zennial.
I'm a millennial, like
right.
you, Jordan. We, there's a good amount of overlap in our TV consumption, I think.
Yeah, and this feedback kind of hit home because I obviously should know better, having grown up spending a lot of time on a farm than to approach something from just a city-based point of view. I think it is because, as you heard me ask our guest in the interview, more than anything else this summer, what I've heard are stories from people about ticks in cities, which, when you're spending time out in nature, in rural Canada, in fields and forests, it's part of the equation already. Like you do know, if not to throw your clothes in the dryer for 20 minutes every time, but to, do a tick check and that kind of stuff. But the scary stuff that I'd been hearing was about people finding them on, their kids who had just been playing in the park down the street. So that's kind of the perspective I was approaching it from. But Jesse is absolutely right. We should have asked for practical advice for people who have to go in and out of the house and work in a field or hike through nature in order to get where they need to go.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was going to say I take a camping trip every year. And when you're out in the bush, there's no way to throw your clothes in a tumble dryer for a few minutes to kill off ticks.
Have you changed your process when you're out there, given the rise in ticks?
Well, I once went out rock climbing with my brother. I had to pull a tick off him with a pair of needle nose pliers and actually accidentally crushed the tick, which is bad news. So he had to go on doxycycline or whatever sort of prophylactic antibiotic you need to take to try and head off the illness at the pass, essentially. So now it's essentially what happens when you get a tick bite, and it's you're supposed to keep the tick, as our guest said. And then if you keep it and it turns out to be a tick that can carry Lyme, then they just put you on antibiotics immediately. Now, just prophylactically, because the test takes so long to come back, and just might as well. Have I changed my process? Not really, to be honest. I mean, I think I check myself a lot more thoroughly now that I'm aware of it. I have friends of friends who have contracted Lyme's disease, and it sounds like a nasty business and not something I want.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I mean, if I'm out on a 3-day canoe trip and I find a tick on me day 1, there's no way to get back to civilization. So I don't really know. Yeah, it's all quite freaky, and it definitely has changed the way that I see the bush.
This is the most middle-aged white professional answer I could possibly give to this, but do you know how my life has changed with the rise of ticks?
How's that?
I abandoned more golf balls in the rough rather than go stepping in there and hunt for them. It's embarrassing.
Wow, that's sad. All those Titleists languishing.
Are you kidding me? I can't afford Titleists. All those noodles.
All those noodles left to die in the bush.
To be found by somebody much braver than I guess.
Right.
Jesse, thank you. Joe, thank you for, as always, walking me through this. Couldn't do it without you.
No, thank you, Jordan. And yeah, I guess just to reiterate, although I've said it probably 30 times so far, but I'll say it again. Thank you all for your feedback, whether we used it on the show or not. And even if we didn't, we read it. We take it to heart.
Always.
It really does inform the way that we produce the show, the way that we think about the show, the way that we book interviews, the way that we write questions. It all really does get incorporated.
And one last thing I will say, and I will start saying this more on the show. We would love to play some of your voicemails. You got to tell us we can play them. We're not going to use your voice without your consent. If you just write to us and sign your name, that's kind of implied consent that, we can read it out loud. But if you want us to play what you say, you got to just say, hey, you can use this on the show if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And please, especially ideas for episodes. We love getting those from across the country, especially if you're, somewhere where we don't maybe cover as often. If you're living out in Saskatchewan or you're out in Labrador or you're out in the territories, please write in with local ideas for episodes, and we'd love to hear them. And who knows? So yeah, thank you again. My name is Joe Fish. I'm the lead producer of The Big Story. Until next time, and enjoy the rest of your summer.
Thanks as always for listening to us.